At 61 years old, I stood in my own kitchen holding a garbage bag while my son-in-law sat at the table I'd bought, drinking coffee from a mug I'd given my daughter for her birthday, and told me it was time I found somewhere else to live. My daughter didn't look up from her phone. It was March, still cold in Sudbury, the kind of cold that gets into the walls overnight and makes the baseboards tick and groan until noon. I had $180 in my checking account, a 2009 Silverado with 280,000 kilometers on it, and apparently no right to be in a house I'd been helping pay for since my wife passed. My name is Gordon. I was 61 years old when my daughter told me her husband needed space to feel like the man of the house. Those were her words. Needed space to feel like the man of the house. I'd moved in 18 months earlier after Evelyn died. Pancreatic cancer. 7 weeks from diagnosis to the end. I didn't have time to prepare for that kind of emptiness, and my daughter had said, "Dad, come stay with us. You shouldn't be alone right now." So I packed 2 boxes and my toolbox and drove the 4 hours from Timmins to Sudbury. I wasn't a burden. I want to say that plainly because it matters. I paid $900 a month toward the mortgage, which was $200 less than the going rate for a room in that city, but I also fixed the cracked foundation step before winter, rewired the outlet in the laundry room that had been tripping the breaker since they moved in, and I replaced the back fence after that ice storm took out 2 panels. My son-in-law had called the contractor for that fence. The quote came in at $20,400. I did it myself in a weekend with materials that cost $340. He never said thank you. Not once. His name doesn't matter. I'll call him what he was to me, my son-in-law. And for the first year, I told myself the tension was circumstantial. New baby on the way. Work stress. The particular friction of sharing a home with your father-in-law. I gave it room. I stayed out of the main floor after 7. I ate breakfast early. I didn't offer opinions I wasn't asked for. But there's a version of being accommodating that starts to feel like disappearing. The conversation happened on a Tuesday. He came home from work, didn't take off his boots at the door the way I always did, walked into the kitchen and said, with my daughter sitting right there, that the arrangement wasn't working anymore, that the baby needed the basement room, that I was making the house feel crowded. Crowded. I'd been sleeping on a pull-out sofa in the basement for 8 months because the nursery took my room. I hadn't complained. I'd told myself it was temporary. "How long?" I asked. He shrugged. "Soon would be good." I looked at my daughter. She was looking at the table, not at me. She said, "Dad, it's just a hard time right now. You understand." I stood there for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. The baby was asleep upstairs. "I understand," I said, "but I didn't. Not yet." I went downstairs and pulled the garbage bag from under the sink, the same place I'd always kept them, same brand, because I'd been the one buying them, and I started putting things in. My good flannel shirts, my work pants, my steel-toed boots, my copy of the bird identification book I'd been reading to my granddaughter. The pull-out mattress had a spring that bit into my lower back on the right side. I'd been meaning to put a board under it. Never got around to it. I left the mattress. I didn't fix it first. My son-in-law was still in the kitchen when I came back upstairs. He moved slightly to the left, like he was making room for me to pass, like he was already the only one who lived there. I drove north on the 69 without a plan. Just drove until I needed gas. Stopped at a Petro-Canada outside Parry Sound. Filled the tank with $40 I could mostly afford. Sat in the cab with the engine running and stared at the receipt. March in Parry Sound. The sun was already down. The temperature had dropped 6 degrees in the 2 hours I'd been driving. I didn't want to call anyone. Not right away. There's a kind of shame that sets in fast. The kind that has nothing to do with what you actually did and everything to do with the optics. A 61-year-old man with nowhere to sleep. My wife would have known exactly what to say. But Evelyn was gone, and I was sitting in a parking lot at a gas station trying to remember which of my friends still had a guest room. I thought of Bernie. I always called him, from the mill. We'd worked together for 11 years before the closure, stayed in touch after. He lived 40 minutes outside of Parry Sound. I'd helped him build a sunroom the summer before Evelyn got sick. He owed me nothing. I called anyway. He answered on the second ring. "You need a place?" he said before I'd finished explaining. "I've got the couch. Get here before 10. I got there at 9:50. His wife, Carol, had left out a plate of sandwiches without being asked. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. That kind of quiet kindness is its own language. I slept on their couch that first night and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the arithmetic. My wife had been gone 14 months. My pension didn't start until 65. I had a truck and a toolbox and a garbage bag of clothes and no address. And somewhere 4 hours south, my daughter was putting the baby to bed in the house I'd helped keep standing. By the third day, I stopped waiting for her to call. I'd check my phone constantly those first 48 hours. Not because I expected an apology. I knew my daughter well enough to know that she wouldn't offer one while her husband was still framing the decision. But because I needed something to confirm I was still on her mind at all. By day 3, the silence had its own texture, dense and deliberate. Bert didn't push me to talk. That's what I appreciated most. He'd go out to his garage after breakfast, come back for lunch, ask if I wanted coffee. Normal, practical, unhurried. He gave me the one thing I hadn't asked for and most needed, which was the impression that my being there wasn't a disruption. On day 4, I drove to the Service Canada office in Parry Sound and asked about my options. My pension wouldn't flow for 4 more years. I had some RRSP savings, not enough to retire on, but enough to bridge a few months if I was careful. I'd contributed to CPP for 37 years. I knew how to manage money. Evelyn and I had never made a lot of it, but we had never wasted it either. What I didn't have was a current address, and in Canada that matters more than people think. Without an address, you can't update your direct deposit. You can't get mail. You can't do a dozen small administrative things that quietly hold a life together. I opened a Canada Post mail forwarding request to Bert's address with his permission. Small step, necessary one. That evening, I called my daughter. She answered. "Dad," she said, "I've been meaning to call." I said nothing. "We just need some time to settle into our routine with the baby," she said. "You understand how it is. He needs to feel like he's in charge." I asked her calmly whose name was on the e-transfers she'd been receiving from me every month for 18 months. She was quiet. "He knows you helped," she said finally. "He just needs to be the provider." "I'm not stopping him from providing," I said. "I was supporting his household." She said, "Can we not make this harder than it has to be?" I recognized that sentence. It was the same one you say when you've already decided and you just want the other person to agree quietly. I didn't agree quietly, but I also didn't escalate. I just said, "All right," and I let the call end. 3 days later, I got a text from my daughter's cousin on my ex-wife's side, a woman I'd kept in civil contact with through the years. She said she'd heard that I'd moved out, that it sounded like it had been mutual, that I'd been wanting some independence. Mutual. The word hit flat and hard. I stared at it for a long time. Then I texted back it wasn't mutual. I was asked to leave. The response came 4 minutes later. "Oh, I didn't realize." That was the beginning of understanding what was actually happening. It wasn't just that I'd been removed from the house. I was being edited out of the explanation for why. Bert came into the kitchen while I was still holding the phone. He looked at my face, said nothing, put the kettle on, handed me a cup and sat across the table. "She's telling people I left on my own," I said. He nodded slowly. "Easier for her that way." I exhaled. "What do I do with that?" He thought for a moment. "You keep your side of the story clean. Don't muddy it. Just keep it clean. That was good advice. I held on to it. A week later, I rented a room from an older widow in a house on Bay Street in Parry Sound, $350 a month, utilities included, shared kitchen. Her name was Margaret, and she was 74, and she asked 2 questions before agreeing. Can you fix a leaking tap? And are you loud after 9? I fixed the tap the first morning, and I was never loud after 9. That room was 10 feet by 12 feet, single bed, dresser, 1 window facing the backyard. I had my toolbox under the bed and my bird book on the sill, and that was mostly enough. I started picking up work the second week, not formally. I just mentioned to Bert that I had time, and he mentioned it to someone, and that someone called me about a deck board that had heaved over the winter. $50. 2 hours. After that, word moved the way it moves in small towns, quietly but reliably. By April, I was filling 2 or 3 days a week. Fence repairs, door alignings, bathroom caulking, a cracked soffit that had been letting in starlings. The kind of work that nobody wants to pay a contractor for, but that drives you slowly mad if you ignore it. I charged fairly, not cheaply, fairly. There's a difference. Cheap suggests you don't value the work. Fair means you've thought about what it actually costs. Margaret started introducing me to her friends. This is Gordon, she'd say. He's handy and he doesn't overcharge. In Parry Sound, that was practically a credential. I wasn't building a business. I wasn't trying to. I was just filling the hours with something honest and keeping the shame from settling in permanently. One afternoon in May, I was replacing a section of fence behind the Legion Hall when a man came out to watch. 60s, grey beard, coffee in hand. He said his name was Ted. He asked if I did indoor work too. I said I did most things. He said the Legion had a storage room that nobody could use anymore because the shelving had collapsed and the door had warped shut from moisture. He asked if I'd take a look. I took a look. It was bad, but not irreparable. I told him what it would cost. He said he'd have to bring it to the board. A week later, they approved it. I spent 3 Saturdays in that room. When I was done, it was usable again. Ted shook my hand and said, "Half the guys who come in here don't have anyone to call when something breaks." That sentence found something in me. I didn't act on it immediately, but it stayed. I'm not going to pretend those months were fine. They weren't. There were mornings when I lay in that 10 by 12 room and felt the full weight of what had happened. Not just the eviction, but the accumulation of it. My wife was gone. My daughter had chosen her husband's comfort over my dignity, and the story being circulated was a version of events I didn't recognize. The loneliness was a specific kind, not the loneliness of having no one, the loneliness of being misrepresented to the people who knew you. My daughter sent one text in those early months, just checking in, hope you're doing well. 6 words. The kind of message you send when you want the record to show you made contact. I replied, I'm fine. I hope the baby is well. Because she was still my granddaughter, regardless of everything else. By June, I had a routine. By July, I had a small but steady list of regular clients. By September, I had something else I hadn't expected, a purpose. Ted had mentioned me to a social worker who ran a program through the local community health center. She was trying to connect seniors with practical home supports, grab bar installations, ramp modifications, that kind of thing. She asked if I'd be interested in doing assessments and installations on a contract basis. I said yes. The work was paid, but not generously. That wasn't why I did it. I did it because for the first time since Evelyn died, I was being useful in a way that meant something. I was going into homes where people had been afraid to ask for help, and I was fixing the exact things that were making them afraid. An 80-year-old woman in Nobel who had been using a plastic lawn chair to lower herself into the bathtub because she couldn't afford a proper shower seat. I installed a fold-down bench, a grab bar on each wall, a handheld shower head. Took 4 hours. She cried a little. I pretended not to notice. a veteran in Humphrey who hadn't been able to get his front door open all winter because the frame had shifted and the latch was binding. I planed the door and reset the strike plate in under an hour. He shook my hand for a long time without speaking. That's the work I did. By November, the social worker mentioned me to the local paper. They ran a short piece, nothing dramatic. Local retiree volunteers with community care network. There was a photo of me adjusting a grab bar in a hallway that had been freshly painted. I looked like what I was, a man with a tool belt in some time. I cut it out, folded it, didn't do anything with it. But someone else saw it. My daughter called on a Wednesday evening in December, 14 months after I'd left with a garbage bag. She'd found the article through a mutual friend's Facebook share. "Dad," she said, "I saw the piece in the paper. You look good. We're so proud of you." "We." I noted the "we." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I've been thinking a lot about how everything happened. I think we all handled it badly. All of us." Another noted word. I said I was asked to leave. She was quiet. I said, "You told people it was mutual, that I'd wanted independence. I have a cousin's text saying exactly that." She started to say something and stopped. I said, "I'm not calling to restart a fight, but I need you to understand that I know what happened. I know how it was explained to people, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She said, "He was going through a hard time." I said, "I know. I noticed." Another silence. She said, "I didn't think it would affect you the way it did." I said, "I slept on a pull-out couch for 8 months. I paid $900 a month. I replaced your fence, rewired your laundry room, and fixed your foundation step. And then I was handed a garbage bag and asked to be gone soon. What part of that did you think wouldn't affect me?" I heard her breathing. She said, "I didn't see it that way." "I know you didn't. That's the problem." The call lasted another 10 minutes. It didn't resolve into a clean reconciliation. That's not how things go between people who are both still raw and both partly right and partly not. But when it ended, something had shifted. She had heard me say the words without softening them, and I had heard her for the first time not have an answer ready. 3 weeks later, she called again. "He won't apologize," she said. "I want you to know I understand more of it now, but he doesn't think he did anything wrong. He thinks he was protecting his family." "From me," I said. "From feeling like a guest in his own home." "I bought my home," I said, "before you were married, before you were with him. I bought that house with your mother when you were 7 years old." "I know, Dad." The house she'd grown up in was gone now, sold after Evelyn died to help cover the costs of settling the estate. My daughter hadn't offered to help with that process. Her husband had been present at the lawyers' meeting by video call and had said very little. "I'm not asking him to feel guilty," I said. "I'm asking him to acknowledge the facts." She said she understood. She didn't say he ever would. What I came to understand over those months is that when people evict someone quietly, they need the story to hold together. The story has to be gentle enough that they can live with it, and if the person who is removed doesn't say anything, the gentle story becomes the only story, and eventually it feels like truth. I've been quiet for too long, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because part of me had hoped she'd arrive at the truth on her own. She didn't. Truth usually needs someone to say it out loud. The following spring, I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a building near the Parry Sound waterfront. Radiator heat, parking included, a view of the bay if you stood close to the window and looked left. I signed a 12-month lease. Paid first and last. First and last. First time I paid those since Evelyn and I rented an apartment in Timmins before we saved enough for the house. 33 years ago, I went to IKEA in Parry and bought a bed frame and a kitchen table. I assembled them myself on a Saturday morning with the radio on. Bird feeder on the balcony railing. Tool box by the door. The apartment was mine. Not a couch, not a pull-out, not a basement. Mine. My daughter visited once that spring. She came alone, brought a plant. We had coffee at the new table and talked carefully around things, and then a little less carefully and then more honestly than we had in years. She said she was sorry. Not in a big way. In the quiet, specific way that means the person has been turning a thing over for a long time and finally found the words. I said, I know. I meant it. My son-in-law did not come, did not call. I don't expect that he will. Some people build a story around themselves that they cannot afford to revise because the division would cost them too much. I stopped needing him to. That, more than anything, is what the year had given me. The contract work with the health center grew steadily through that second year. I trained 2 other volunteers, both retired tradesmen, in how to do the assessments. The social worker applied for a small federal grant under a Seniors Independent Living Initiative, NHI funding, National Housing Initiative, some of the federal money they'd been putting toward aging in place. We got $18,000. It paid for materials and a small honorarium for the 3 of us through the spring and summer. I'm not telling you that to impress anyone. I'm telling you because I was 62 years old, sleeping in another person's basement 11 months earlier, and now I was accountable for a funded program that had helped 41 people stay safely in their homes. 41 is not a large number. It was large enough. The local CVC affiliate ran a short segment, 3 minutes on the morning program. They filmed me installing a threshold ramp at the entrance to an older man's bungalow in Seguin Township. The man was 83. He'd been afraid to leave the house in winter because the step down to the porch had no railing. He'd told me his daughter was worried he'd fall and she'd have to put him in a home. He didn't want to go to a home. After we finished, he stood on the porch and gripped the new railing and just stood there for a moment, tested his weight, looked out at the yard. Good to know I can get out if I want to, he said. That's all it was. That was enough. My daughter watched the segment. She called that evening and said, Dad, you seemed really at home on camera. Her voice was warm. Genuine, I think. I said, I'm at home doing the work. She said, I know you are. A few days after the segment aired, I got a LinkedIn message from someone I hadn't heard from in 16 months. My son-in-law. Hey Gordon, saw the CVC piece. Looks like things have worked out well for you. Good to see. I read it 3 times. Looks like things have worked out well for you. I set my phone down on the table and sat with that sentence for a while. Looked out at the bay. A pair of mergansers were moving along the ice edge. Cold and calm out there. He was not wrong that things had worked out. He was very wrong about the framing of why and what it had taken and what I had lost to get here. He was congratulating himself for an outcome he had not intended. I did not reply. My daughter called one more time that spring. She asked if I'd want to come for the baby's 2nd birthday. I said yes. I brought a wooden pull toy I'd made in Margaret's garage over the winter, sanded and painted, small enough for 2-year-old hands. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door. Firm, brief, the way men shake hands when they've agreed to be civil and nothing more. That was fine. Civil is enough when truth has been spoken and heard. My granddaughter ran across the kitchen floor when she saw me. She grabbed my hand with both of hers the way small children do, full grip, complete trust. We sat on the floor together, and I showed her how the pull toy worked, the little duck that waddled when it moved, and she laughed the way children laugh before they've learned to be measured about it. I held that for a long time after I drove home. I still live in the Parry Sound apartment. The bird feeder needs filling every 4 days this time of year. The program has expanded to a 3rd township. Bert and Carol come for dinner once a month and we argue about hockey and eat Carol's pierogies, and it's enough. Evelyn would have liked this version of the life. Quieter than what we planned, more uncertain, but solid in the ways that matter. I want to say one thing plainly to whoever is listening. Being asked to leave is not the same as being unwanted. Being quiet is not the same as consenting to a lie. And being capable is not a reason to be abandoned. It's just a skill that made it easier for someone to assume you'd be fine. I was fine, but not because I didn't matter, because I decided to. My name is Gordon. I'm 63 years old now. I was told I was crowding someone else's house. I was never the problem. If any part of this landed somewhere familiar, if you've ever been made to feel like a complication in your own life, I want to hear where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. Tell me what you would have said at that kitchen table. We put out a new story here every week. Stories about men who kept going when they had every reason not to. Subscribe if that's the road you're on. You're not crowding anyone. You never were. There's a moment I keep coming back to. Not the kitchen. Not the garbage bag. It's the pull-out couch spring. The one that bit into my lower back every night for 8 months. I never fixed it. I always meant to. And I think about why I didn't. The honest answer is that I was trying not to take up too much space. I was folding myself smaller, quieter, more convenient, as if becoming less would make me more welcome. It didn't work. It never does. When you shrink yourself to accommodate someone else's discomfort, you don't become invisible. You become easier to remove. That's the first thing I've had to sit with. The choices we make out of love, and sometimes out of exhaustion, have consequences we don't always see until they're already underway. I moved in to help my daughter. I paid rent, fixed fences, rewired outlets, and I said nothing when it started to feel wrong. That silence wasn't wisdom. It was avoidance dressed up as patience, and avoidance has a cost. The second thing I've had to reckon with is what I did after, because there was a choice at that Petro-Canada outside Parry Sound. I could have let the shame settle permanently. I could have decided that being pushed out meant I was worth pushing. A lot of men do. They carry that version of the story quietly until it becomes the one they believe about themselves. I didn't do that. Not because I was strong in any dramatic sense, but because Bert left the porch light on, because Margaret asked if I could fix a leaking tap, because Ted said half the guys at the Legion didn't have anyone to call. Small things, ordinary things, but I paid attention to them. That's what I mean when I talk about intelligence. Not the kind that scores well on anything, but the kind that notices what's actually in front of you and decides it's worth responding to. The third thing is harder to say plainly. When my daughter finally called and said we handled it badly, she meant well. But she also meant it partially. She was still protecting him a little, still smoothing the edges. And I had a choice about how to receive that. I could have needed it to be more complete than it was. I could have waited for the full acknowledgement, the unqualified apology, the version of the truth that would have satisfied every part of what I'd been through. I didn't wait for that. I took what was real in what she offered and I let the rest go. That's not weakness. That's what it looks like when you've done enough of your own repair work that you don't need someone else's confession to confirm your worth. Gordon is not a name that will mean much to most people who read it, but I know what it took to get from that kitchen to the waterfront apartment. I know the weight of the garbage bag. I know what it cost to rebuild without noise, without drama, without anyone watching. What I've come to believe is this: the shape of a life is determined mostly by what a person does after the moment they had no right to expect, after the porch light goes off, after the phone stays silent, after the story gets rewritten without them. Some people stay down when that happens, not because they lack the will, but because nobody ever showed them that getting back up was still an option. It was always an option. It still is.